Welcome to the 700 Club. 150,000 rockets, all aimed at Israel. That's the arsenal built up by the Iranian-backed terrorist group called Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. What's worse, most of those rockets are aimed at Israel's civilian population.
Hezbollah is also using the Lebanese people as human shields for its terrorist actions. So how is Israel responding to this blatant threat? With a state-of-the-art countermeasure. Chris Mitchell explains from Jerusalem.
In 2006, Hezbollah fired nearly 4,000 rockets at Israel for more than a month, forcing Israelis to seek shelter. Today, the terror group has amassed an arsenal of some 150,000 rockets and could fire as many rockets in one day as they fired in that 34-day war.
In the ongoing week, we are exercising several scenarios against the terror organization Hezbollah.
Colonel Barak Hiram says the IDF exercise is all about getting ready for the next conflict. They face a complicated battlefield and enemy.
Hezbollah is targeting most of its arsenal against civilians and Israeli civil population. Secondly, is holding most of its activities embedded within the Lebanese civilians and using them as a human shield for his terror actions.
Tactics haven't changed in 15 years, although the scope is likely larger.
And we will not hesitate to take the most severe measures against those who are aiming thousands of rockets and missiles against innocent civilians for one purpose: to kill them. This is something that we will not be able to tolerate.
For years, the IDF has documented how Hezbollah embeds its war machine within civilian infrastructure, like schools, hospitals, and homes. That's why Israel is preparing a state-of-the-art countermeasure. These are exclusive scenes of new IDF units called Sufa. They operate on the battlefield to direct fire at the enemy, while also protecting civilians. Using integrated touchscreens, software, and real-time intelligence, personnel synchronize air, land, and sea forces to target the enemy. Hezbollah wants the IDF to miscalculate and hit the terror group's human shields. The mission of these Sufa units is to constantly check and recheck targets so civilians are not harmed. The goal: wage war, be humane, and deprive Hezbollah of a propaganda victory. Military leaders expect these units will make a difference, as the next war will undoubtedly require boots on the ground.
We understand that in any scenario that will occur in the future, we will be forced to use ground forces and to maneuver inside Lebanon in order to eliminate threats against Israel and in order to protect the Israel's sovereignty and civilians all around.
At a background briefing, CBN News learned this next conflict will be known as the First Northern Front War, since Hezbollah is so entrenched in both Lebanon and Syria. And the IDF adds the next war will be on a bigger scale and hopefully create a new situation inside Lebanon, a scenario they hope ultimately leads to peace. Gordon?
Chris, you were invited to a background briefing with the IDF. What message are they trying to send to us?
Well, Gordon, I think, first of all, they want to say war's coming. I know it's been 15 years since 2006, but they know Hezbollah is getting ready. They're getting ready. Most believe it's not a question of if, but when. And they want the world to know the kind of battlefield they're facing. It's deliberately designed by Hezbollah to put civilians woven into harm's way. And they see it as sort of a Western democracy kind of war against Islamic fundamentalism. They're also saying they've got new technology and units like we just had in this report called Sufa. They're designed to both win the war while protecting civilians. And now they have this integrated state-of-the-art battlefield for the IDF, coordinating land, air, and sea. And they're synchronizing intelligence in real time. And for the IDF, that's key. And one final point, Gordon, they say this could change Lebanon as we know it and could eliminate Hezbollah's grip on Lebanon.
Well, how is it going to do that? Because certainly Lebanon it's no longer a viable state. I mean, there's no such thing as a government in many places, even in Beirut. So how would this bring peace?
It's a great question, and they really didn't go into a lot of detail, and I thought that was the most intriguing statements they made is it could create a new scenario. Now, what did they mean by that? I took it to mean the possibility, not definite, but the possibility that they would actually go in not only to southern Lebanon, but actually further up, perhaps to Beirut. They did that in 1982 to actually eliminate the infrastructure of Lebanon. Many people say right now Lebanon is not a failed state, it's a false state because Lebanon is the real power inside Lebanon. So if they can defeat Hezbollah and its infrastructure, and one of the goals they said, Gordon, was they want to eliminate Hezbollah's ability to wage war. If that happens, perhaps Lebanon can change.
Well, it'll be very difficult for them. You were on the front lines back in 2006, and that was the conflict that proved the IDF isn't invincible. There was a lot of problems there, primarily because Hezbollah was so dug in. There was this whole tunnel complex. It's like the entire southern part of Lebanon was turned into a war camp, and they were all dug in with extensive tunnels. So what's changed in the past 15 years to give the IDF this kind of confidence?
Well, a lot of things have changed, Gordon. First of all, your dad and I were up there on the reporting on the front lines in 2006. First of all, it's the number of rockets. It does pose a substantial threat to Israel, 150,000 rockets. The other thing they're saying is they're precision guided, some of them. That could be a game changer and a strategic threat. Hezbollah could hit targets like IDF bases, power plants. They also had drones in their arsenal right now, and their soldiers have been trained in Syria, fighting in that civil war for years. But the difference, I think, Gordon, for the IDF is they're not going to fight the war, the next war, whenever that may come, unlike the war they fought in 2006. That was sort of an urban warfare kind of strategy. This time they say they're going to go in further, they're going to go in faster, and they're going to try to prevent civilian casualties. But they realize Hezbollah represents a strategic threat. So I feel it's going to be a much bigger war on behalf of IDF to try to eliminate Hezbollah as one of its main threats on its northern border.
Well, let's turn to the politics now. UN Watch has now raised calls the world to look at 3 anti-Israel resolutions coming out of the UN. One of them is quite specific to this area, saying that Israel must withdraw from the Golan Heights, which is inconceivable in light of what Hezbollah is doing. So tell us about these resolutions. Tell us what's going on at the UN.
Well, Gordon, it seems another opportunity for the UN General Assembly to demonize Israel. Believe it or not, since 2015, the UN General Assembly, it's condemned Israel 115 times, the rest of the world 45 times, and that's with the world including China and Iran. So the 3 resolutions, the first one had to do with the so-called provocation by Israel against the holy sites in Jerusalem. It ignored all the Jewish and Christian connections to Jerusalem. It didn't refer to the Temple Mount, but only Haram al-Sharif. Second one, it stated that Israel's settlements are illegal in all of biblical Judea and Samaria. That's the West Bank. And the third resolution, as you mentioned, was a deeply concerned, that's the way they put it, that Israel has not pulled out of the Golan Heights. But it ignored Syrians' history that you know well about shelling the Galilee before Israel took over the Golan in 1967. The good news, the U.S. did vote against all these resolutions. And also, even though it was a lopsided majority, most of the countries, more countries, I should say, abstained than they did in the last vote.
All right, Chris, thanks for the report. Thanks for the insight. And let me remind you at home that these are stories you're not going to hear anywhere else. They're here on CBN News. If you want more information about Israel, I encourage you to watch Chris's weekly show. It's called Jerusalem Dateline, and you can find it at cbnnews.com.